Appreciate it. While we wait to begin, so we have Richard here, and he's calling it at midnight, Robyn.
Yes, I've done that,
Richard. Would anyone else like to just briefly introduce themselves with their name and where they're calling from?
Hello, it's Andrea Frost here. I'm calling from New South Wales, Department of Premier and Cabinet. And excuse me, I've come in on the phone rather than VC because I'm at home sick today and I don't think anyone needs to see that. So,
Hi, Andrea.
Hi, how are you?
Good, thanks.
David, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, good evening. My name's David Durant. I'm the Senior Business Analyst for the digital team in the Greater London Authority in London. So that's the metropolitan local government body for London. So my job is building digital sites for policy teams in the authority.
Terrific. Thanks for joining so late, David. And I know Richard's it's also quite late for him. I will get started as we wait for others to join, but thank you for joining us in Apolitical April, a conversation on the future of government. I'm delighted to have with us here Professor Robyn Keast. She's a professor in public management at Southern Cross University School of Business and Tourism in Australia, and co-author of a terrific book, Network Theory in the Public Sector, Building New Theoretical Frameworks. Robyn was recommended to us by a senior public servant in New Zealand, and we're really delighted to have her here today. And with that, Robyn, I will let you take it away.
Well, first of all, can I also extend the apologies from Bob Agranoff, who's not well and wasn't able to contribute this morning, but I hope I'm able to put forward some of Bob's views that I have to say we don't always agree, but we mostly agree. So I think you had a number of questions, but if I can just give a little bit of background about myself, in that I, as well as being an academic, have quite extensive public service background. You can see here on one of my slides, I think it's more than 20 years. It's a bit embarrassing to look back over the time. So I've worked in Australia and New Zealand and also in Canada, and also have quite a bit of experience in the non-profit sector, which I think has been a really great contributor to my research because it's always kept me fairly grounded. So if I can just move through, I had a couple of slides, and I think this slide that I've got up here now is just a good representation of where we're at. You know, we're trying to move from silos over to much more fluid ways of working using different models other than straight hierarchy. And it seems that to me that the hierarchy and bureaucracy is slightly out of favour, but as a former public servant and somebody who, I guess, receives services from the public sector, I'm still very strong on bureaucracy and hierarchy to some degree, and certainly the delivery of public services. And I think it's possible to have that and agility and collaboration. It's just a matter of working through what it is that you want when you need it. So that would be, I guess, part of the theme for me, is that being very clear about what it is that you want to achieve and which method is best to do that. And the next slide that I've got up is some of my newer work, I guess, where I used to be quite well known for what was called the 3 C's, myself and Myrna Mandel. But I've extended that in more recent times because I think it's really clear that we've got competition that's entered into our environment. And also you're seeing the merging of quite a few bodies, so I call that consolidation. And I guess for me, the thing is that, you know, competition is often seen as the bad guy in this whole relationship. And I've come around, you know, I was one of those perpetrators, if you like, but I've come around to a different view. And I think it's the type of competition that we're seeing. Certainly in the non-profits, there was always competition, but it was the sort of competition where people would work together or work against each other, but for the betterment of something. But at the moment, what's being set up is competition where we're looking to, the argy-bargy competition where we're looking to completely decimate our opponents. So I think there's certainly competition is there, and to my mind it's actually it's got merit. We need to work through which and when we use that, but it's the right type of competition. And I think certainly government has to think that through a lot more in the way that it sets up its tenders, in the way that it sets up its funding arrangements. So for me, I guess it's that all those 5 C's have got merit and application, and it's about mixing and matching those to what it is that you want to achieve. So if you want to be independent and information sharing and just adjusting your actions, then you're really just cooperating. So you don't need to go to that full extent of way down the trail for collaboration. If you want to do the same but do it more efficiently and effectively through joint projects, etc., and alignment of resources, then really what you're looking to do is to coordinate. But if truly those are the 2 main things that most of us do in our everyday life, to me collaboration is something very, very different. It's high resources, it's intensive relationships, and it's really there for systems change or transformation. And it requires some very, very different ways of working that unfortunately isn't really the way that government is set up for. So government has to really change its ways of thinking if it wants to be a collaborator. It can't be in charge. It has to let things roll through. Again, if you want more choice than competition, and if you want unity and cohesion and economy, behind the scenes economy, then consolidation. So your first question that you put to me was, how do we become anti-fragile by design so that we get stronger under pressure, and does this necessitate a radical redesign? Well, I really don't think so. In my view, I guess, is that silos actually are actually quite efficient ways of working. You get attention to detail, you get people working together around, very specific types of things. And I think, most of our work that we do is done in those sorts of things. They're actually quite agile because you've got relationships in there that you can work through. The problem is that they lack that capability to win in a business or a change setting. And so it's around that innovation. So for me, there's a way you can go about it rather than busting silos apart and, having greater fragility and fragmentation. I think it's really about connecting the silos in the right places at the right time. And, for those who, I was going to use the example, if you like, of the New Zealand earthquakes, because what you see there is that what they're doing is they are actually building strong buildings, but putting in the middle of those buildings buffers and things that allow them to spread some of the load across some of the weight. So I guess that's really what I'm saying, is that you don't have to bust your silos. You can adjust your structures, especially on the edges, to keep that stability you need for core delivery. And so the design task then is, how do you connect the silos in the right places or at the right edges with the right people at the right time? And how do you, it's really about being clear about who you connect with, about whom and what and when. So I'll stop there, and if people want to ask me some questions or, get something going around this first point, I'm very happy to listen to you.
Thanks, Robyn. Thanks, Robyn. And please do unmute yourself before you speak.
Yes.
Hi, this is David coming in from London. So the question about keeping silos as they are at the moment, there's quite a lot of occasions where if a citizen is trying to execute some kind of change of life transaction, let's say they're trying to start a business or they're getting married or they're moving house, that you have to bridge across an awful lot of different silos. And what people are often looking to do is a way to interact with the government through a service that would enable them to complete all the things they need to do in order to fulfill that particular scenario without having to interact with a lot of different silos. So if we keep the silos separate as you're advocating, how does that enable them to do that as frictionlessly as possible?
So I'm not actually advocating keeping them separate, David. What I'm saying is you can create networks around that, and the networks become your point of contact. So I guess what I'm saying here is that it's about connecting, it's about bringing them together in a network form. And those networks can become quite, in some ways, separate entities, but they've got their ties back into the foundation.
Hi, this is David from Costa Rica. I have a follow-up question there. I think it's a super interesting idea to kind of have the right people in these silos connected through networks, or maybe even through communities of practice. Do you imagine that as something that would be a formal structure of the state, or is that kind of an informal, bottom-up organized kind of a network that really has no formal existence within the government officially, but still exists, still connects people? I'd be super interested to hear about your experiences with that.
So for me, it would depend on what it is that you're looking to achieve. So if it's David in London's question, then it would absolutely have to be a formal structure, a formal structured arrangement. But if you're talking about communities of practice or bottom-up experiences, then it certainly could be a more informal. So networks come in a range of ways. They can be goal-directed, serendipitous, or mandated networks. So to my mind, it would depend on what it is that you wanted to achieve. But if you're looking to achieve something like a digital portal, then certainly it would need to be quite formal, because it would have the mandate of the delivery of a government service, which obviously people want to have structure around that and legitimacy around it. But so it's very much about, again, that idea I've talked about is that, the right people at the right time, but also the right purpose. What is it that you're looking to achieve? And you structure your governance around those types of things. And I guess one of the things you have to be careful about too is that when you form networks, is that they can become quite powerful entities in their own right. And one of the case studies that we looked at here in Queensland, in Australia, was a very good network that came into being with very good intentions, that became so powerful that it threatened the hierarchy to the extent that it was disbanded almost over a weekend. So, networks aren't these always nice amorphous things. They can actually be quite powerful and also quite threatening. So the ability of government to work in both silos and networks really does require some very special skills and capabilities of people that are working in them. Does that answer your question, David?
The David from Costa Rica, yes.
Yes. So what sort of a network are you talking about? What are you looking for to achieve?
Here in Costa Rica, we're actually, how to describe it? Like, everything you've said so far really resonates. And actually what we've kind of observed is that there are not only silos, like this logic of silos extends beyond the state. And yeah, there's definitely the different possibilities of Cs, between silos within government, but there's also an incredibly rich potential of collaborating with silos outside of government. And so one of the things that a few folks are thinking of kind of facilitating is a network that may become a community of practice of people who want to work towards projects that are of public interest, where there's some people who are inside silos in government, but others that are inside silos outside of government. And it'd be very self-managed And the idea would be that it explicitly would be powerful and somewhat threatening to old ways of thinking within hierarchies, such that old ways of thinking within hierarchies would essentially become irrelevant, because the real power of how things are moving come from forward-thinking people within those networks.
Yeah.
Summary.
I hear everything you're saying, and I would also just stress you have to make those less vulnerable. You really do need to have some tie back into some legitimacy back into your main places, because what happens is that often these networks do become so powerful that they are a threat. So you need to make sure that they come through and have got that bridging into some sort of legitimacy to keep them going, so that it's not seen as a threat. It's actually seen as advantageous to have them out there.
Okay, good point.
And the other thing is that self-organising networks, the ones that I've seen that have worked really, really well, the workers have really taken this on board and have a strong commitment to it. But they're also very conscious of the fact that they're kind of working out on these branches well away from their normal authority. So you have to make sure that they've got permission, if you like, from their managers, or so they've got a mandate to be able to work in those places, because sometimes they end up doing these two jobs that are quite, they have dual roles, if you like. One's a network role and one's a public servant or an organisational role, and it can be very difficult to straddle those two at different times. I think that's one of the main problems that I would say as a public servant myself encountering, is that they you have two roles and almost two masters, because in a network your commitment, especially in a collaborative network, your commitment is to the network, which is very hard for a government to accept if they see you as, certainly you're a public servant. So you have to be able to navigate those roles and get some legitimacy to act in there. And also, especially in a collaborative network, to have the power to speak for government in those networks, because it's very clear and unambiguous around the table if you don't have that ability.
Can I just jump in with a few things at this point?
Sure.
So the first thing I wanted to say was that in terms of role-based networks, the Government Digital Service, which is part of the Cabinet Office in the UK government, has got a number of really quite well-established role-based networks for things like cross-organisational service design, and product management and various other bits and pieces. And that's a model that's supported by the hierarchy, because they see the value in forming these kind of networks. And they've been running for a few years now and have been providing a lot of value. The second thing I was going to say was that it was really interesting. The other day, David was talking about networks that reach out of government, perhaps either into the private sector or the third party sector. And there's a really excellent book by a lady called Beth Novak, who I think works for the United States Digital Service, called Smarter Citizen, Smarter State, which is very much about exactly that. It's about building networks that start in government but end outside of government, and how to leverage that delivery capability and that expertise. That's a very good read. And then the third thing I was going to say is that one of the things that's just started to ramp up in the UK at the moment is an organisation called One Team Government. And that again is a cross-organisational network which is specifically set up to encourage and enable cross-organisational working. And one of the things, I'm kind of on the edge of that organisation, and one of the things that they're doing at the moment is they're ramping up a international conference which is happening in July, which is dedicated to the idea of bringing together the kind of people from different countries who really want to start building these cross-organisational flat network bodies and bringing them together and talking about what the best practice for that looks like. And they're very keen to talk to people from other countries, gain experience from them. And if people can make it to come to our conference and pass those things on. So if anybody wants to know more about that, please contact me on the platform.
Sure, that sounds great.
Yeah.
So, Debbie, we haven't heard from you.
Hello.
Yes.
Sorry, I was a bit of a late arriver and then my internet fell out. I'm working in the Australian Public Service, in the Public Service Commission, and trying to do a whole heap of work around public service reform, struggling against a bit of a cement hierarchy, and finding little pockets of innovation that we're trying to leverage off, but I guess struggling and kind of keen to network in with anybody else I can to help us, try and reposition the public service into the future.
Yeah, I think you had some very, very wise words there about pockets of innovation, and that would be one of the things that I would really strongly suggest is you find those pockets of innovation and then you start linking them up, and that becomes your strength point and also gives you the agility then to make those movements that I was speaking about before. I think it's a wise way. You're not going to bust a silo, but you can insidiously creep through and change things via these networks, because you're leaving behind some residual ideas and different ways of thinking. So working in a network or a collaboration, which obviously I see them as slightly different, but they are about different ways of working and different ways of behaving. And once you've got them in there, people start to pick that up.
Yeah, I guess the thing that we're struggling with most is a lack of having champions. Like we can get it so far, and we've got terrific ideas and fantastic momentum, and when we've got a great champion and a sponsor to help us, we've got no money, and that's fine. I think that probably makes you more innovative. But without that sponsorship and a champion to help you actually navigate, you can end up tied to the back fence with, a quarter of an inch of lead and, no capacity to actually do anything.
Yeah. So Debbie, how are you? Have you looked for champions and?
Yeah, very much. So I work with a range of deputies, or did. I'm now not able to access them, but yes, I'm constantly knocking on doors and tapping on windows, looking for people to help wherever I can. Not always successfully, but continually, persistently.
You can always get champions from outside as well. Influential people from outside can be very strong champions for you.
Yeah, so talking to the ANU, talking to the Uni of Melbourne, we're taking very much a future of work view and trying to sort of line up the public service so that it's prepared for the future, whatever that might look like. So trying to leverage whatever kind of support. Talking to people in Canada, talking to people in Istanbul, talking to you guys. Yeah, like I said, tapping and knocking on doors wherever I can.
Do you know about ANZOG?
Yes.
Yes, there's some very good people in there who are excellent in this space.
Well, I'd love to meet with them.
John Butcher is having a workshop on the 26th of May in Canberra on his work on collaborative governance from an ANZOG.
Okay.
And people like John Wanner will be there for that.
Okay. Great. That's really helpful. Thank you.
You're welcome. So I guess just to wind it up, I think what we're talking about here is that there's often bureaucracy and silos are often seen as old-fashioned and all the rest of it. I think they still have a place, but it's really about how we use our networks in whatever way, as goal-directed networks that David in London's talking about, or the more bottom-up serendipitous sort of communities of practice that David in Costa Rica is talking about. It's about how we use those to change the edges of these silos so that they're much more functional for us and allow us to have that ability to move when it's required. But that said, it still does require you to, it doesn't just happen by magic, as Debbie in Canberra is finding out. You have to find your champions and your sponsors, and you have to set these things up in ways that allow you to meet your goals. If you just say, "Oh, I'm going to have a network," well, not always successful. Perhaps I'll move on to the next question. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Oh, one other thing I was going to say, and this might relate to your question, a couple of your questions. One of the things that I'm really interested in at the moment and kind of pushing is the idea of value-adding connectors. So lots of us are really good at just making connections around, you should go, like I've just done to Debbie there, you should go and make contact with John Butcher. Well, a value-adding connector is the sort of person that actually facilitates that connection and makes sure that at the end of that connection, there's actually a value that comes out of it. So I've got some ideas around that. I've said here, you make real connections. You assess the quality of those connections. Are they strong or weak? What do I have to do to build those? You have to understand your network. As a value-adding connector, you understand where your network is and how to use it and leverage it. And you're very deliberate in that leveraging. And I think it's also, for me, it's about curating, convening, putting the information out there and trying to bring people together via connecting efforts. So maybe they're just some of the things that you could think through, Debbie, that might help you with that.
Thank you. Yeah.
So question 2, where I was asked about what were some examples of effective collaboration on a complex issue across all of those sectors. Well, I had 4 in fact, that I sort of use very regularly. The Services Integration Project at Goodna in Queensland, the Sacramento Water Forum in California, and the Wagga Wagga Impact Network. And the reason that I like especially the first 2 is that they are really classic cases of complex, dealing with really wicked issues across multiple levels of government, across various different sectors. And if you just bear with me, I'll give you a very quick story about the Services Integration Project. It's an area, it's a regional area slightly outside of Brisbane in Queensland. It's always had massive social problems, and lots and lots and lots of money has gone into it. And there was the death of an elderly gentleman that caused by some young people, and it really galvanised that community, and it made the social services there realise that they all shared a certain responsibility for these young people falling through their gaps. And it galvanised them to see that they actually had to work differently. And government had said to them, look, we've already put so much money into you, you really have to change this. And so they spent quite a lot of time working together, working out what it is that they were going to do, and then working out how they were going to work together. And in the end, they decided, they actually had participated in a graduate certificate of public sector of interprofessional development that was created specifically for them. And it was 2 days a week, 2 days a month for 6 months. Everybody in this grouping came together, including the CEO of the local council, including all the heads of government in that space, to unlearn their old ways of working and relearn or learn new ways of working. And through that, they changed everything, the way that they worked, and they were actually able to change the entire governance of that area. And the other thing that was really, really interesting about it is that they started to realise that they all had this shared responsibility, and where they were pointing fingers at each other across the table saying, well, you put the mental health hospital here, and you put the railway line through the middle of this place, and you did this and you did that. They started to realise that if they actually put things on the table, they could have these joint solutions, and they did that. They also ran that graduate certificate. They ran it all the way through to the volunteers and in the community. And I can go back out to that community now, 10, 15 years after that intervention, and people will still talk about SIP. This is the way that we do things here. this is, you're doing it because it's the right thing to do. I'm not doing it because I have to. I'm doing it because it's the right thing to do. So they really did change the way that they work by a very, very strong collaboration. In addition, they also had at every meeting a specialist facilitator, and that facilitator would say at the end of the meeting, well, how did you go? Do you still all feel involved? Is this where we want to go? Does everybody feel like you're part of the decision-making process? So that's a well-structured case study that you can get, and they still operate in sort of a very informal way. And the neighbouring communities have actually borrowed on the SIP model to implement change in their communities as well. So I think that's a really nice example of a great collaboration, and one that's got tentacles that have lasted well beyond the actual funded project. The other one is really, really famous, and it was written by a woman called Sarah Konak from the USA, and it was her PhD thesis. And it's on the Sacramento Water Forum. And if you know, California water is always a big issue. So this was quite some time ago. But what had happened is that they were suffering quite some considerable drought. And different groups of people were complaining about the fact that they couldn't get water. And it's very similar to the SIP project. You had these people meeting and saying, well, you're putting the dams on this, and your agriculture is messing up our rivers and all the rest of it. So you had quite a lot of tension. And these people had been meeting and meeting and meeting for many, many years. And eventually the only place that they would actually meet would be in court, where they were actually suing each other. So it was very, very, very tense, very, very, very complex, because you had all sorts of different players in it. And after many, many years of this, they decided that it wasn't tenable. The water was getting worse. There was, pollution. There was dribbles of water going through. They changed the way. They brought in a specialist facilitator. And this woman said, I don't want you to go to any more meetings. What I want you to do is to go and have informal meetings and learn about each other. And so that's what they did. They had lunches and dinners and very informal meetings, and they started to realise that they all shared a common interest in the quality of the water. But what was stopping them from going forward were their positions. They were embedded in these positions that, I'm the water authority, therefore I should have this. So they were able to change through these facilitated dialogues. They were able to change the way that they worked and thought about water and about the way that they worked with each other. And were able to create an agreement. And that agreement is still in place to this day. And from there, they'd gone from, only talking to each other in court to really be able to change that whole process and the way that they work together. It's a fascinating case study. You can get her PhD. I've written on it. If anybody wants it, I'm quite happy to share it. But and also Ines and Bua have written on that story. It's absolutely brilliant. If you want to understand somebody that's done a really good job of navigating a complex system, it's a great example of collaboration and collaborative governance. And the third one is the Wagga Wagga Impact Network, which I think is a great example of a fantastic collaboration that didn't work because it didn't have champions. So they did everything right, absolutely everything right, but they didn't have their channels into high-level decision-making and high-level legitimacy. And because of that, they were never able to leverage all of the work that had been done on the ground. It still operates, but it didn't quite reach its potential, in my view. So there's three that I think are really good. Two of them are well known and written up in quite a lot of work. The SIP project was recently put in Eric Han Klein and Joop Koppenjan's book. It was actually my PhD, so I know it really, really well. And I'm happy to share those two case studies with you, and I can give you some information on Wagga. Any sort of questions on those or reflections?
Yeah, I have a couple of questions. This is David from Costa Rica again.
Yes.
It kind of seems like from the three cases you shared that things have to kind of get really bad first for people to realize and I just wonder if you have any comments on that. Second, it also seems like identifying a high-level champion is important. And one of the things I'm wondering is, what are the characteristics of that champion, other than, you know, being in a position of legitimacy and being able to protect the initiative? To what extent does that champion really need to understand the logic of the collaboration? You know, like my intuition says that, you know, if they are really connected at a paradigm level with the logic of collaboration, then they would be a very stable champion. They'd be willing to defend what you're doing, you know, through thick and thin. And maybe if they kind of would like a better outcome and they kind of generally understand the idea that maybe working with other people would help, then that's maybe not as stable. But I'm wondering what you think.
Yeah. So to answer your first question is, most of the literature would say that a crisis, or when things are really, really bad, is when people do look to collaborate, or when there's a need for systems change or innovation. And the reason for that is that collaboration is high risk and it's high reward, big rewards if you can get it right. But there's enormous costs associated with doing collaboration correctly. You know, it requires very intense interactions. It requires a lot of resources that have to be redirected. There's also the possibility for, you know, that the work that you're doing is actually taking away from other work that you might be doing. So there's lost opportunity costs involved in all of that. So there's, you know, collaboration isn't really something, if you're going to do it properly, and you should always only enter into a collaboration with a really strong, genuine intent, it is high resource intensive, and more than 70% of collaborations fail, which is quite scary, isn't it? And they fail because they often weren't what was needed. You know, there's a fad concept out there that everything has to be collaboration, when actual fact there's many opportunities to do things in other ways. So I'm very cautious of saying to people, you only enter into a collaboration when you really need to. So most people want to stay in there doing things the same. So that would be one of the other reasons, David, is that you enter into it when you really want to change something, or you really want to be innovative, or when you really have to change things. And that's what most of the literature would support around that. There's a nice piece by a woman, name just escapes me at the moment, but I'll think about it, who has written about this whole crisis aspect of it. So I think that's right. The other part was about the champions, and I would agree with you. I think champions are really, really important. And I think, as you pointed out, the more that they can be embedded and acculturalized to that network or what you're trying to achieve, the better. They're much more stable. They are much better able to argue your point, because you want them to be your point person. But that said, if you can get people who are interested in outcomes, who kind of understand what you're doing, and get them involved, they can become skilled in that process and start to learn and become very good champions for you. But I agree, stability is really, really important in these things. And one of the success points of the SIP project is that all members of that agreed that they wouldn't change. These were very high-level senior public servants and very high-level community-based organisation representatives. They all agreed for the 4 years of that project that they wouldn't change their jobs, which is quite remarkable. So they understood how important it was to stay committed and stable in that particular collaborative network. So stability is very important, and you need a champion who knows how to navigate a system, who knows how to shoot the breeze and bring those resources in, but especially to provide the legitimacy for you in these quite risky, on the edges endeavours, I think. So I put up a few things here about collaboration success factors. To me, you know, it's all about the relationships. You really need to have very, very strong relationships. And the work I've done, it shows it takes up to 3 years to build a strength of relationship for a really successful collaboration. And most times we're given, you know, a few months to form a collaboration. The Annie Casey Foundation in the United States, which is probably one of the largest non-profit funders, used to fund for 3 years and now has reviewed its practices, and it provides funding for 5 to 6 years to enable organisations to build those strengths of relationship. But you know, you can actually turbocharge for things like the graduate certificate that I spoke about in the SIP project, or some of the, you know, really intensive negotiation exercises that the Sacramento Water Forum did. I think the other things is really being very strong about having a strong common purpose and commitment. And I guess one of my little soapboxes at the moment is around government, is that I think it's very easy to follow fads and not stick to something. So to me, you know, the ability to say that this is what we're going to do and we're going to stick to it, rather than being lured in by the next fad that's come through. You know, we've had quite a few of them in recent times. We've had, you know, networks, collaboration, co-creation, empowerment, engagement, collective impact. I can probably go on, but they're all really the same thing, just dressed up in different labels. And what happens is that you commit to a project and then this new thing comes through, and so you've got to change your language and your ways of operating to, you know, fit those criteria. So I would really like to see a lack of attention to fads and really sticking to something because it's the right thing to do and showing some commitment to it. The other thing that's really important in these collaborations are the micro processes, you know, about being very careful about following through on ways of ensuring that everybody's involved in decision making, that there's good discussions, that there's good dialogue, and that there's processes in place to deal with conflict. That would be some of the really important types of things that I would add to it. Any thoughts about those?
This is David again. I think it's super interesting that you note that there's a different skill set that's required, and I'm wondering if you could kind of provide more details on what that skill set is and what kind of trainings you might think about to acquire that skill set.
Yeah, well, it's quite interesting. There's been a bit written in recent times. I've written on it, and I know Rosemary O'Leary has written on it also, and also so has Bob Agranoff. And I'm happy to share some of those with you. It's really about the skills is the ability to be able to build relationships and nurture relationships and understand the importance of relationships. It's about understanding process. How do you build a network and get things going? It's certainly negotiation skills are also incredibly important, but I'm talking about win-win negotiation or interest-based negotiation there. And that's about how do you move people from positions, you know, your embedded positions, to your interests. And that's quite a skill set that's there. Some of the work of Mary Parker Follett, who's got a 100-year anniversary this year, is actually so illuminating in that area. So if you can ever read any of her work, it's fascinating and just so on point in today's environment. The ability to read an environment, be politically savvy, is also important. The ability to be a good manager, but also manage in a different way. So in a network, you don't have formal power, you've got influence. So understanding how to use your influence, letting go of power so that others are able to build it and feeling confident about that. There's many others, David. I'm very happy to share those with you. In fact, I could have put them on part of this slide. So I think there's like process skills, there's management skills, and there's relationship building skills. Kind of those three sets of characteristics. was that, I think that was it, wasn't it? Oh, and how do you teach for them? Well, it's really interesting. I read an article just yesterday about education in Australia, about teaching, and they're saying, well, this is all very well, you've got all these competencies, but there's nothing there about how you build relationships, and that needs to be part of embedded in our training. And we often talk about soft skills, and I think there's a great interest now by industry in those. So industry is now saying to universities, for example, we don't want necessarily all these other things. What we want to know is people who can actually be collaborators, be innovators. So we want those sorts of skills to be embedded in your curricula as much as the hard things like how to be a project manager. So I think there's a big shift in educational arenas around that. But I think also a lot of this happens through you being a really good modeler of what you do. So if you're a good networker, you're also an educator, in my view.
Thank you.
So I put up a couple of the references there if you want to chase up on those case studies. We'll see how we go with those. A question was around the longer term planning and solutions for 3-year political cycles. And it's a classic, isn't it, for those of you that are in the public service. I think part of the way around it for me is that it's about, there's strategic planning, which is your long-term view, which is about where it is that you want to go, and having a vision for the future and having a commitment to, following that through. But at the same time, there's operational plans, and they're your 3 to 4 year plans. And I think for me, it's about, if you can understand the relationship between your long-term plan and your short-term plans, which is like a reference document, that becomes the conduit to making sure that those two are aligned. Because you often find that they're not. You often find that there's a vision, but what you're doing on the ground's a little bit different. So I think there's a need for a lot of consultation around that to get these 2 sets of plans sorted through. And then creating year-by-year targets that you can use to support the strategic plan and the strategic vision, to show, small wins and feedback to them about, well, these are the sorts of things that we're doing on the ground, and this ties into your vision here. So it's about making sure that these 2 long-term and short-term planning processes aren't too separate. I think also it's about appointing good people who understand where you're going and how to link the operational to the strategic plan. And I think I've said here is that, a specific but flexible 10 to 15 year plan with costings for each stage. So I've just recently been involved in a big project here in Queensland for strategic asset management planning. And I know, you're probably saying, what's she doing with that? But interesting enough, it's all about networks and collaborations and integration. So it is really quite relevant. And what we found is that people are understanding and being freed up by having a strategic plan to be able to work much better in more innovative and flexible ways in terms of their operations, by being able to say, this is how my current working fits into that strategic plan, whereas previously they had to be much more bureaucratic and show exactly how it all lined up, and there were often gaps. So now there's a greater freedom to be able to work in different ways by linking these things via your networks and innovations. And I think, to my mind, if you can be really clear about how those 2 link up and show that flexibility allows that, then you're on a path forward. Any thinking about that? Was this one of the questions that you guys were interested in? Sean, are we still out there?
Yes. Marissa or Michelle or Jill, do you have any questions?
Yeah. Hello, it's Jill here from New Zealand.
Hey Jill, kia ora.
Kia ora. Hey, one of the things just hearing you speak now for me is about that visibility, and I think it relates a bit to what you were saying earlier about how you link up those pockets. But do you have any suggestions or ideas for getting this new ways of working, collaboration, networks, etc., more visible, that include those connections, but other ideas for that visibility? Because I think that's one of the things we struggle with here. There are pockets, but they're just not very visible.
Yeah. And sometimes they like not being visible too, because you can actually do a lot. You can do a lot when you're under the radar.
Well, yes, yeah, that's true.
Yeah, I think it's about showing your wins, and when you do show your wins, and people like to see that something's working. And certainly in a political environment, that's very advantageous to show that this is what's working. And guess what? It's not actually costing a lot. And guess what? People are really behind this, and showing this add-on effect of working in this different way, that it's got a value add, and that it actually isn't costing anything, but in fact is actually adding value and contributing, bringing the right people together, depending on what it is that you're working around, of course. But if you're working, across some of, like a colleague of mine, Elizabeth Epple, does a lot of stuff in farming and water, and she's showing how bringing together those groups and the farmers and the I forget the name of the company, the milk company, and all the rest of it, bringing all those groups together is producing lots of benefits. So those, by showing the wins that you can do and showing the aggregate and individual benefits of those types of things, I'm a great believer in translating research into tools, and so I translate nearly everything I do into fact sheets, and they have to be beautiful. So you always have to. Well, I say that sort of in a smart way, but it's actually really true. You can do the best piece of work possible, but if it doesn't look good, people don't really pay much attention to it. So I've learned this over the years, that you produce things in nice ways, and it's much more tenable. There's an audience for it. So I do that. I like to share things through podcasts or create tools. For example, I've got a collaboration decision support tool that I use, and it's a free public. It's out there. So, producing things as well as showing what you're doing is really important in that visibility. Showing the value of what you do and the consequences of it, that and we'll talk about that in terms of the wicked issue one, is that if you deal with a wicked issue now, it means that you're not dealing with it for perpetuality, because wicked issues go on and on and on and on and on. So by attacking this now and having some wins around it, you can create visibility and legitimacy in what you're doing. And I would create artifacts around that and make sure that people see them. Get some friends in the media who are able to talk about these sorts of things. Again, your champions, that's part of their role, is to make you and those networks visible.
That's fantastic. Thanks.
Robyn, Jill, thank you all so much. I'm conscious that we're nearing the end of the hour, and given that this is the first time that we've done Apolitical April, I'd love to open it up for the last few minutes and learn where would you like to see this conversation go from here? How can Apolitical support you past this conversation? David,
I think we need an artifact. An artifact.
An artifact. What would that artifact look like?
Well, something on your site to reflect on this and maybe draw more people into the conversation, get some more visibility for this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe something that, it's Debbie here, something that can help champions to become champions, you know, some sort of guidance. I think people want to, but our leaders are bureaucrats and they don't know how to. And I think any sort of guidance you can give them on what that means and what attributes they need to bring to the fore would be terrific.
And I think that's a really good point. I think people genuinely want to do these things, but they just either don't have the time and space or you know, that full skill set that allows them to do it. Yeah.
Yeah.
So one thing we do like to do is, well, first of all, we do like to have members do write like 700-word pieces and reflections in their own work. And perhaps if anyone would like to volunteer, or if a few people would like to volunteer to write one together, we could think about writing an artifact on sponsors.
Yeah, I'm absolutely in for that.
Yep.
That sounds great. I've left some resources on at the end of these slides, and I'm very happy for any of you to contact me to talk about, you know, anything. I'm happy to do that. I actually live in New Zealand 3 months of the year, most of the time, Jess. So, yeah, I think this is a fantastic idea, and I think you know the work you're doing is obviously very, very important, and your ideas are great.
Robyn, do you think you might be willing to take a first stab, given what you've discussed today, and then we'll share it with the attendees for comments and feedback, and then we'll publish this collective piece on Apolitical. Would that be fine?
So let me get it clear, Sean. I think you're being a champion here. So you want me to write 700 words on what I've spoken about?
Yes, and specifically thinking about, I mean, what people have found most useful is to write something that tangible as an outcome. Again, the word artifact is very is very apt, and I think that the word sponsor and the idea of a champion is an important one coming out of this conversation, and that might be the place where people would find most relevant.
Yep, sure. Yep, happy to start it. Do I just send it to you, Sean?
Yes, if you send it to me, then I can then share it with other attendees, and they can give comments and thoughts, and then we can publish it on the platform.
Sure.
Fantastic.
Yep.
Hannah,
Great.
did you have a thought?
Yes. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Cool. I was going to say maybe instead of 700 words, could it be a sketch note? I can see that Robyn has already kind of created some sketch notes, and they really appeal to me. That's another way of communicating ideas.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
So
yes.
I could have a crack at that if you want.
Yes, and we could publish them together, so we could have
Cool.
different tools, because I know people learn in different ways.
Yep.
David, did you have any ideas based on your work with One Team Gov? We'll share that resource to One Team Gov Global after the conversation, but that was a good idea that you mentioned.
Yes, I mean, I'd be very keen to contribute on that once there's a draft. We've had some quite interesting advantages over here in London because some of the very senior civil servants have been quite supportive of the One Team Gov movement. And I think the way that we mostly generated that is there's a 2-day conference that's been running every year for a very long time called the Top 200, where the top 200 civil servants in the country get together, and normally people stand on a stage and talk at them, and they try to, not do their email in the audience. And so for one of those days a couple of years ago, I don't know how many people on the call are familiar with the concept of an unconference, where you turn up and it has no set agenda and people pitch sessions at the start of the day. So
I love that.
I like it too.
So what we did was there's a lady called Kit Collingwood, who's effectively the head of One Team Government, and she's one of the senior people in our benefits department. And she pitched this to the head of the civil service, and he said, okay, we're going to give you the second day to do something with, just to see if, you sink or swim. And we ran a non-conference where all these really senior people left all their job titles at the door. So you ended up with a lot of people talking to each other, and it was all first names only, and you didn't know what department anybody came from or what silo they were in. And people went to sessions where it was all, you didn't know what grade anybody was, and it was all very flat, and they came away really inspired from that. And so we've built a lot of things on top of that. So in a lot of ways, we've been quite lucky, but I'm very happy to write something about that, or some of the other things that One Team Gov have been doing once the draft for this article gets sent around.
Yeah, David, there's Dr. Claire Moran is now in the Cabinet Office, and she has participated in several of those. So I know Claire from the International Research Symposium on Public Management, which, by the way, is in Wellington next year in March.
Ooh!
Yeah.
Thanks.
Claire is very skilled in that area.
Yeah, I mean, I just came across her name recently and thought that's somebody that I've definitely got to look up. So thank you for the reminder.
Yeah, she's good value. Yeah. We often run interactive panels where there's no papers and just a set of questions very similar to this. So I think that again is another artifact or a boundary.
And I'm conscious that it's now the end of the hour, and midnight for David and 1 a.m. for Richard. So thank you all so much for taking the time today. Hannah, do you have any I see your hand is raised. Did you want to say something, or had you already gotten it in?
No, I already got it in. Thanks.
Terrific. Well, thank you all so much for joining. I hope some of you have, and especially for Robyn, for your presentation. I hope some of you have good ends to your days and others have good beginnings.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
That was fabulous.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you.
That's excellent.
Bye.
Bye.
Robyn, thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed that.
Yes, it was great. I think there's a lot to be learnt from how to do it. I think probably get better at it as we go along. But yeah, keep me in mind, Sean. I'm really happy to do more of that. And there's certainly a lot of other resources that are out there. I've got colleagues that do a lot around facilitation, and she would be just brilliant to have present for you.
Yeah. Yes, I agree. And I mean, the concept of sponsors, and then I'll let you go, is we had a call earlier today on community engagement, and the topic of sponsors and champions was very, very important to her. And so when you mentioned it today, it reinforced this notion that there ought to be some piece on Apolitical as a means for us to cultivate that.
Why don't you do it by having, somebody who's a good champion speaking with somebody that kind of knows the literature?
Yeah. Do you have any idea? I mean, because what we can do a series almost, but it would still be nice to have like a takeaway coming from this specific conversation, and then we can get profiles of individual champions who could speak to their work.
Because sometimes that's actually much more powerful as, somebody's, we know all the theory and what you need to do, but somebody that's actually had to do it and talk about their emotions about it. And because I think David from Costa Rica was very right, there's different levels of championship. But yeah, look, I'll start on this. It'll take me a couple of weeks though. Is that okay?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
I've got a few. I only actually work 1 day a week. But I've got a few students who've got their PhDs ready to be examined that I've got to read. So I'm just a little bit under the pump. But look, basically what you want me to do is just like a bit of a reflection on today and covering off, and especially talking about the idea of artifacts and champions and etc.
Yes, and I might, in that case, I may ask a few of then the public servants who join the call to share some of their thoughts as well.
Yeah,
so you'll have something to work with. But thank you so much, Robyn. We appreciate it.
You're welcome. Yeah. Okay. Bye.
Bye-bye.